So what I want to show you today is we're going to compare and contrast two different methods of controlling highlights, shadows, dark areas, light areas, that sort of thing in a photograph. What I'm going to show you is what I believe a better way to do it than what you normally might be taught. So first things first, you take your regular image and you're going to adjust it and all that sort of stuff, yada, yada, yada. Let's just say this is good. So I'm going to open the image in Photoshop. You've gotten it as far as you can get in Camera Raw, but when you're looking at things, there are certain places like, under the eyes might be really heavy shadows. And that might have been something you just couldn't control because of the sunlight that day, or because the person you're photographing might have a real heavy brow structure, and just cast shadows. The initial and first way that a lot of people would tell you to start lightening that sort of a thing up is to use these two tools right over here called the burning and the dodging tool. And some of you may have found these tools. They're very handy, but I don't use them anymore. I used to use them all the time. And the name comes from old traditional darkroom stuff. When you used to lighten something up, you used to take literally usually it was a little wand, like a metal wand, and you'd cut a piece of paper out or a cardboard and you'd stick it on the end. And then while you were making the print, it was exposing a piece of photographic paper. You could take that one and you could stick it in between the light and the print in certain areas, move it around, and you would be able to lighten a specific area of your image. And it was very handy. The burning tool, you would do the opposite. And here it's got a little hand. Some people use their hand. I liked to use a piece of cardboard, and I'd cut a hole out. And then you would add exposure to it in just a specific area using that hole punched through a piece of cardboard to make areas darker. So, for instance, if I take this dodge tool and I start going up underneath the eyes here, I can lighten things in the midtones here just like that. And you can see the very subtle lightening that's happening under her eyes. The problem is it also starts to change the colors, and you can go way too far, way too easily, okay? Well, that's one problem, okay? The burning tool does exactly the opposite. Well, actually, let me not leave the dodge tool for a second. The nice thing about this is you can control it based on shadows, midtones, or highlights. So theoretically, we'll only burn and dodge one of those two things. And you can change the exposure or the power of the tool, basically, so that if it's lower exposure, you're going to be changing it in smaller increments. But even the same, you can still just do too much. But it is rather nice to be able to lighten certain areas. But I do find that it sometimes changes colors and does all stuff like, sorts of things like that. The burn tool does exactly the opposite, okay? The burn tool essentially darkens areas so that you can add contrast. Now, where in here might you want to do that? I really honestly don't know. I can't think of any. But let's just say you wanted to obscure something. Maybe you wanted to bring that little highlight here right underneath her eyes down. You could do that. You see that? Okay? And then what ends up happening is it starts turning kind of grayish. If you don't have, now she looks like she got punched. So it's not good, okay? And again, it's really easy to go too far, and the tool doesn't always respond the way you want it to. No, we're not saving this. Okay, so here's what I like to do. This takes more time, but your amount of control is incredible. I introduced layer masks to you guys the other day in a demo. We're going to use those a lot in the future, and here is one of the best examples of how to. And with our next assignment, we're actually going to get really big on these. So I'm going to go over here, and you'll see in the layers palettes here, or above the layers palette, we have this thing called adjustments. And if I double click, you have a series of adjustments that you can make. Hue, saturation, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, vibrance, color balancing, all sorts of different kinds of adjustments. What we're going to stick with right now is we're going to stick with the curves. And I'll show you why in a second. I like levels. A lot of people like levels, but I like the curves because it's a little bit more powerful in my mind. So I'm going to click on that, and what that does is it adds this layer right above our original background layer. And then it gives me these options. And what you see here is another histogram. So remember the histogram that we talked about in the Camera Raw plugin? This is basically a bar graph of all the pixels and their tones in the image. Down here to the left of the shadows, over here to the right of the highlights. Now actually, and sometimes it starts flip-flopped where the highlights are on the right and the curve is going this way. I don't like that, so you can change it. Anyway, so what you can do here is you can go in and you can start to change your image. So if I want to lighten up her eye, I can lighten up that eye. Now here's the major problem, right? I've lightened up the eye, but now the rest of the image is getting blasted. It's way too hot. So what we can do is we can actually use these the layer masks to adjust exactly where we want that to be. And it doesn't take that long at all to do. So I'm going to back up a little bit here. I'm going to go grab my brush. Make sure I've got black and white chosen in my colors, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my mask, and using the black, I'm going to make this adjustment layer transparent everywhere except the eyes. So let's get a really big brush here. We'll start this way, and I'll put the full hardness on and make the opacity 100%. And now you can see I'm getting back to my original, okay, image. Now once I get up to the eyes, and what's interesting is now I realize that the original image may have been a little bit underexposed, but that's okay. Once I get to the eyes, I'm going to switch my brushes. So once I get into about here, okay, I'm going to change my brush. I'm going to take the hardness all the way down, take my opacity way down, 30%, somewhere in that area. Maybe size my brush down a little bit. And now I can go in and I can smooth that transition. Now what am I actually doing here? I'm painting black. If I option click into the layer mask, this is what I'm doing. You see that? And as I change that, it smooths out what's going on down here. Let's take the opacity up a little bit here. Go a little faster. Okay? And what I will like to do oftentimes is I will have a layer mask for each individual object that I might actually want to change. So you can see how I'm just blending in these edges so that they don't show up. Now what I'm finding is I went a little too close here, okay, right underneath the eyes, and so some of this is still a little dark as part of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in with my eraser. And that's the beauty of this, is it's infinitely variable. The danger with the burn and dodge tool is once you save it, you come back tomorrow and you don't like what you did, guess what? You're stuck with it. Whereas this way, you can lighten up certain places in a person's face or anything like that very specifically, and you're never stuck with what you've got. You can always go back and change it. And you can very, subtly smooth things out, okay, and change the way that they work and the way that they look. So now I'm going to take the eraser tool. I just hit the E key, by the way, to get to that in case you weren't paying attention. And take my opacity way down on the eraser, and I might lighten that back up right here. Okay? And once I've got my mask kind of set up, I can also go back and I can readjust things. So I might sit there and say, you know what, this is too much. I need to darken it down a little bit. And because this here is adjustable on the layer, on a separate layer, basically my adjustments are infinitely variable. And essentially I have an unlimited number of undos. Not really, but what I have is this ability to be completely flexible all the time and to adjust very specific places of the face or of any scene that you want to lighten certain specific areas. And it's far more flexible than your burn and your dodge tool because those end up being permanent. Even if you're smart, if you're using the burn and dodge tool, you should always make a duplicate layer. And then you burn and dodge on the duplicate layer so that if you mess up, you can always just delete that layer and go back to your original. And that makes a lot of sense. But here, it's even better because it's on its own layer, it's got its own layer mask, and I can change it, you know, I can make an infinite number of changes. So it's still not really great. She still kind of looks like a reverse raccoon. And part of that is because I think her rest of her face is a little too dark. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another curves layer underneath that, and we're just going to lighten up the midtones a little bit. Now here's the lesson from this. You'll notice that as I do this, her eyes continue to get brighter and brighter and brighter. These things are cumulative. So the order that they're in actually really matters. Now, not as much in this case, but sometimes the order really matters. But what really happens is it does adjust based on the layer below it. So if I lighten it in one layer and then I lighten it again in another layer, I'm actually brighter than I was before in the area that's just around her eyes. So I need to then take this down and make it much more subtle. And now I think we've got a much better image. So let's take a look at before. So that's the way her eyes worked, and then that's what I did before. Now it's starting to look really good because I lightened up the whole thing, which I probably should have done in Camera Raw anyway. And here's an important thing. Look at our histogram here. Do you see these gaps? When you see these gaps, this is a warning that you are starting to degrade the quality of the image. What that means is that there are pixels missing from this area of tone. So this tone here no longer has any pixels. Because what I'm doing by lightening things up with the curve, I'm stretching out my tones, basically, and I'm throwing away some of them, some of the colors and some of the tones. So if your histogram looks like this, it's not to say that it's bad. It's going to. When you start doing some of this stuff, you just want to be careful because you need to understand that this is getting thrown away. Now, notice what happens when I take this and I turn that off. When I turn off this bottom curves layer, notice how the histogram kind of comes back together again. The lesson here actually is this is good visual reinforcement. Make your adjustments in Camera Raw first. Because in Camera Raw, you have the full 16-bit color image available to you, and you won't be throwing out as many pixels when you adjust the exposure, the brightness in Camera Raw. So if I saw this, if I was getting to this, and then I realized all of a sudden that I had to make a global adjustment to the entire image, I would actually trash everything I did. I would go back to my Camera Raw image, I would brighten it up a little bit and bring it back into Photoshop so that I would preserve the data that's there. Since I'm doing a demo, I'm not going to go up and do all that, okay? But that's another really important lesson. Make every adjustment you possibly can in Camera Raw. You have more pixels and more colors in Camera Raw than Photoshop is going to use once you open it. You want every adjustment you possibly can in Camera Raw, because as soon as you start making adjustments here in Photoshop, you are technically starting to degrade the quality of the data in the image. You're throwing pixels out when you start adjusting these. Okay? Now consequently, I can also do other things with this same deal. So if I hit this little arrow, I'll get out of here. Let's take our hue and saturation. And so what I can do is I can pump the saturation up way high, which looks kind of ugly, right? Oh my. But if I take that layer mask, okay, and I get my brush, let's take full opacity now. Actually, I could keep that on the background if I wanted to. Yeah, so then we'll desaturate her face. We keep that background nice and saturated. That's pretty cool, okay? Right there. And then I'd have to do a lot of work in here for the hair. Although less than you might think, because it's blurry, so I can just use a lighter brush with a little bit less opacity and it'll still look pretty good. You just need to do the transition from where the hair is not as saturated to where the hair is saturated. That's the important part, okay? Starting to look better there. Okay. But then let's say even more, so I've got good saturation there, that red really comes out. Okay, look at that. That really makes a pop to the image. It also makes her hair a lot blonder, so again, you might want to work a little bit on that and fade out some of the hair here and just be real subtle and real careful. You don't have to get it perfect because again, some people do have really blonde hair. You don't want to change it too much again, though, because remember our ethics of editing photography. We don't want to change who the person really is. So it might take a little work. And then, let's say I have another, and what's cool is take a look at the mask, actually. Okay? And I like to do this, by the way, every once in a while, click in here, so I can see that I missed a pretty big area in her face there. And I might really want to make sure I get that. So go up here. Take my opacity all the way up. And I might actually just do it blind by just going in here. I don't always recommend that, but since I know where her face is pretty well, you can do that. And then, yeah. Make sure that that's done completely. And then I could honestly add another hue saturation here. Do it again, but this time, take everything out except her eyes so that I can control the saturation of her eyes a little bit more. So I'll just go here like this. Actually, it might even be easy just to go erase it completely, which is silly because then and then you go in here with something about like this. Get your eraser tool. And then you can start bringing that back in. And bring some of the saturation back into her eyes. It's a little bit much. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll do that so that I can see what I've done and see where I've been. Or instead of that, you could change the color. Okay, so you could make the color completely different like that. Go in, just make sure your selection's really good. And then again, we don't want to change who she is. Okay, although now you're all of a sudden seeing, wow, I could really just I could totally change her eye color. Yes, you can. But we're going to take the we'll take it right back down to 0, and then we just boost our saturation, and we can take and make them a touch darker so that they stand out a little bit more. Or we could also increase some contrast, so I could go back here, grab my curves, throw another curves layer in here, then I can option drag and take the mask that I just made for her eyes, copy it over to the new one, and then I could boost the contrast in her eyes, okay, by adjusting these two little guys here. So now take a look. Let's go back. Okay, that's enough for the demo now. Let's go back to our original image. And here's the thing. Have I changed who she really is? I haven't changed her hair color. I haven't changed her eye color, much. I've maybe made it more saturated. I haven't, changed how big her nose is or how big her lips are like they do in some of these things. So these changes all here, I mean, some of them may be pushing that edge of being a little bit on the, so changing the eye color, making it more saturated, if it's subtle, nobody's going to argue. But there may be some debatable things here. But this is our original image. Now, assuming we did it right in Camera Raw, this would be about where we would probably be. And then I add the lightness around the eyes just to take those shadows up a little bit, okay, so they're a little more natural. I haven't done any healing brush or any work like that. Then I saturate the background a lot more. Look at that. That really takes the image and changes it, doesn't it? I need to work some more on the hair, but it's pretty good. And then I saturate her eyes and darken them a tiny bit. And then I add some contrast to let the rim, the light, the edge around here change. Now, if I take my hue saturation, now notice I did make her eyes a little darker. I should probably put that back to 0 on the hue saturation so that I can use the curves that I added here for the eyes to control that very specifically. And because one eye is in the light and one eye is not because of the hair, I might actually create a separate curve layer for each eye. Now the last thing that I want to go over in this whole demo is this. I got a lot of layers here now for what is really a simple image. It's very easy to get lost. So one of the things that you should be doing as you start playing with these, double click on the text and start naming them. That's BG stands for background. Actually, I'm not going to say eyes, I'm going to say pupils so that I know it's very specific. And then I'll just say curves, eyes. And then I'll put in parentheses contrast so that I know what I did. It's like I'm leaving myself little notes, you know? And it's really important because you'd be surprised, well, you probably won't. It's very easy to forget in the course of even just 1 or 2 days what you were doing and which layers were which, okay? So this kind of thing is really important. Just don't go willy-nilly and start adding adjustment layers like crazy and forget where you were, what you're doing. More than once I've had students delete a layer only to realize a day later that they needed it. And then they get really confused. And it takes them 3 times longer to do anything to make it back up again because now they're got a little gun shy. And they're like, what do I do? I don't know what I changed. And so now and you never get the same image again. I mean, you never do. You get something maybe close, but you know, it's stuff like this is a one-time work of art in a lot of ways. You know, your adjustments are intuitive. Your layer masks you're painting with Photoshop in a lot of ways. And so 3 days from now, if your image is gone and you have to redo it, you won't make the same changes perfectly. You might come close, but you're never going to make the same image twice. And so if you really like what you're doing, you want to preserve it. And in preserving it, you want to leave yourself as many notes as possible and make sure that you're doing things on their own layer. And that's really where this comes from, or comes out of, is you want to make sure that you're doing everything on its own layer if possible, okay? And that's really key here. That's why the burn and the dodge tool I don't work with those anymore in Photoshop. If I'm doing stuff like this in Photoshop, I'm using the adjustment layers because the adjustment layers are infinitely variable and you can stack them, you can just do tons of stuff with them and it becomes really, really powerful. Now, one last little bit of advice. If you are going to do a cologne layer or a healing brush layer, do that first, or if you don't do it first, turn all these off and make sure that you put your cologne layer or your healing brush layer, okay, underneath all these adjustments so that you're only cloning and adjusting and healing the original layer from the original layer. Do not have your healing layer up above these. And let me show you why. So let's take this, I'm going to drag this up here. And then I'm going to turn all these on, okay? And I'm going to take my healing brush and I'm just going to do a couple real quick things, okay? So there, and there, and there. Okay, so now I've done a couple quick swipes with the healing brush. And then let's say all of a sudden I decide that I don't like my lightning. And I make it darker. Oops is right. The healing brush took into account all the all the changes that I had made when it did its work. You see? So what you want to have happen is you want your healing stuff to be underneath, and that actually makes it worse. Okay, now you want it underneath when you do it. And the other problem is, with the healing brush, notice it says sample all layers. So it's very important to turn these off when you do your healing brush, okay, so that it takes into account only the original layer. And so that way all of your adjustments, okay, happen to the healing brush layer as well. And now I can go in and I can change my lightning layer, or I can change the saturation layer or whatever, and it's going to affect that healing layer as well. Does that make sense to everybody? That's a real big mistake that a lot of students make when they do this. Okay, so these are awesome. These adjustment layers are amazing. And we are going to continue using them more and more and more. And our next assignment is going to require you to use them a ton. And I think you'll really enjoy the next assignment. Any questions? All right, let's go.